On the 24th of February 1983, 21-year-old Donald Decker was serving sentence at the Monroe County Jail for receiving stolen goods when he received a furlough so as to attend a funeral in Stroudsburg, Pennsylvania. Decker's grandfather had just passed away, and because he was not considered a threat to society, but rather one of the most quiet and introverted inmates at the jail, he was allowed a weekend pass. But Decker did not want to go. No one knew it then, but he supposedly kept a dark secret about his late grandfather. And after attending the funeral, that secret came back to haunt him for several days, during which Decker is said to have entered trance-like states, levitated, and even made it rain. All incidents witnessed by 9 confirmed and credible eyewitnesses, including 4 police officers and a jail supervisor. The sensational case was first featured on the mystery documentary television show Unsolved Mysteries 10 years later, then again on Paranormal Witness in 2011, episodes which introduced Decker to the world as Rainboy and the Rainman, while eyewitnesses came forward to share their testimonies about what happened during that incredible, unforgettable, and quite possibly demonic weekend in February 1983. My name is Laura, and you are watching The Paranormal Scholar. In the Unsolved Mysteries episode titled Rainboy, which aired on the 10th of February 1993, Don Decker claimed that his grandfather, the man he pretended to mourn, had physically abused him from the time he was just 7 years old. He claimed that no other part of the family knew anything about what happened, and it was like good fighting evil. With the man dead, Decker assumed that the evil was gone, and as such that everything would change. And change it did, only not in the way that Decker had hoped. After the funeral, it is reported that the young man was completely unnerved by the way his family glorified his grandfather's memory. And so he decided to spend the night with family friends Bob and Jeannie Kiefer in their home at 528 Ann Street. There, he claimed, the uneasy feelings stirred by his grandfather's memory returned to haunt him. He described feeling a deep chill that was all of a sudden followed by a strange trance-like state. Supposedly, at almost the same time, water began to drip from the living room walls. Not merely that, the dripping is said to have swiftly turned into rain inside the living room while the rest of the house remained dry. The unusual occurrence prompted the Kiefers to notify the landlord, Ron Van Wy, who arrived at their residence shortly after to assess the situation. According to his account, there were no pipes in the front end of the house to leak, meaning that there was basically nothing there that the water could have come from. Moreover, upon closer inspection, he claimed that the water was not only coming from the ceiling down, but that it could also come from the wall over or from the floor up. It made it seem to him that there was no basic direction from which the rain was coming, and that it could come from anywhere. As such, it was utterly inexplicable. And so, puzzled, Ron telephoned his wife, and then the police. When Officer John Bojan arrived at the scene, he was just as confounded, and so brought in his partner, Patrolman Richard Walbert. When he arrived, Walbert was told just to walk into the house without any details. When the patrolman requested them, Bojan insisted that he trust him and simply walk inside. And so it was that, with Bojan following close behind him, Walbert walked inside the property and was immediately stunned. Describing what happened that day, he claimed that he couldn't have got 2 steps inside the door before he was absolutely pelted by water. And not just that, as he was standing just inside the front door, he allegedly witnessed a droplet of water traveling horizontally, passing between him and his partner before traveling into the next room, defying, in short, the very laws of physics. Returning to the testimony of the other officer, Bojan described feeling a chill going up his spine whilst at the scene. Things, he suggested, were happening at the property which were beyond even his wildest dreams. There was, he said, no way of explaining what was going on. And so, baffled, the two officers returned to the station so as to report the bizarre incident to the chief of police. The Kiefers and Don Decker also left the house, walking to the pizzeria across the street, while the landlord, Ron, and his wife stayed behind. Strangely, Ron claimed that when they left, everything else left too. The rain stopped. The house was normal. And so this led to Ron and his wife considering that maybe, somehow, the phenomenon had been caused by one of the three occupants. Meanwhile, across the street, the Kiefers and Decker sat with Pam Scrofano, the owner of the restaurant, who supposedly visited them earlier that day and had seen the rain firsthand. According to her, Decker seemed as if he were in a trance. He would look at you, she explained, but not knowing you were there. And so it was that she wondered if the young man was possessed, a suggestion which she immediately shared with Jeannie Kiefer. Mere seconds later, so her testimony alleges, there was water all over the pizzeria too. Terrified, she ran to retrieve a crucifix that she kept to the cash register. According to the restaurant owner, the minute she put it on Decker and it touched his skin, he got burned. She further claimed that Decker was making it rain himself, that he was doing it without realizing he was doing it. These events made Decker believe that, indeed, the phenomena must have something to do with him. After all, it seemed to follow him wherever he went. When he left the house, the rain stopped, and then when he left the restaurant, the water ceased to manifest also. Returning to the Kiefers' house, the landlord's wife and Jeannie were both quick to accuse him of having caused the incident. And so it was that, as the women were confronting Decker in the kitchen, something all the more incredible supposedly happened. First, the pots and pans over the stove started rattling, and then, sensationally, Decker levitated off the floor. Describing what happened to him in the Unsolved Mysteries episode, he claimed that 1 second he floated, and the next he was pushed into a wall by a force that shoved all his body at once. A few hours later, officers Bojan and Walbert returned to the house, this time accompanied by the chief of police, a man who has been described as a hardened skeptic. And yet, according to Officer Bojan, when the chief got to the house, he was pelted with water, just as Rich and I were. I got the impression that he was put on the spot, maybe a little bit embarrassed, like we expected something out of him that he could answer. There was no way to explain what happened. I think he was put in a position where he might have felt a little uncomfortable. Even so, the chief is claimed to be the only person who witnessed the living room rain to deny that the cause was paranormal. Instead, he believed that it was caused by a plumbing issue, and so ordered the two officers to return to work. While Officer Walbert said that the chief could not provide a concrete explanation for the incident, Officer Bojan claimed that he flat out denied it, and that he tried to convince him that nothing happened at all. But for Bojan, there was nothing that his superior could have said on the matter. "I saw it," he later said, "and that's all there is to it." And so, with such a sensational incident spurring such sensational testimony, word of the Kiefer household's strange rain seems to have spread among the local police force. For only the very next day, 3 other officers were sent to continue the investigation. However, far from conducting a conventional examination, securing the scene, collecting evidence, taking samples of the liquid, or even questioning Decker and the others, the 3 policemen decided to use unorthodox methods of investigation. Supposedly, they placed a paper bag over Decker's head so that he could not see. They also put his hands behind his back. Then, one of the officers by the name of Bill Davis placed a gold cross in one of the young man's hands. The religious object, so Decker claimed, burnt him. When Davies picked it up, he noticed that it was indeed hot, but not hot enough to burn him, and so he held on to it. Thereafter, Decker is said to have levitated again. According to Lieutenant John Rundle, who claimed to have witnessed it firsthand, he lifted up off the ground and he flew across the room with the force as though a bus had hit him. There were 3 claw marks on the side of his neck, which drew blood. completely confused, the officers could not come up with a reasonable explanation for what they had witnessed. A young man thrown seemingly across the room by unseen hands. They had certainly never seen anything like it before, and so, unable to stop the rain or help Decker, the situation was placed into the hands of religious authorities. According to the property's landlord, on the third day of the paranormal activity, every Protestant minister and Catholic priest in Stroudsburg were contacted, only for them to refuse to intervene. Finally, an evangelical preacher agreed to attempt an exorcism. According to the landlord, as she started to pray, Donnie went into a convulsion. He started to shake. He pulled himself up into a ball, and the longer she prayed, he started to relax. Also in attendance, the landlord's wife claimed to have seen how Decker's whole body seemed to quiet completely down. Supposedly, she could also feel the house itself take on a totally different feeling. By the time the preacher concluded her prayers, the rain stopped and the water was gone, never, so the witnesses affirmed, to return inside the house again. As for Don Decker, he too appeared to return to his old self. And yet, upon his return to jail, with his 3-day furlough having expired, it is said that Decker once more found himself at the center of inexplicable happenings. Put in a maximum security cell with another inmate, Decker claimed that he thought of making it rain inside the cell when, all of a sudden, water started coming out of the concrete floor. By now convinced that he could trigger unexplainable things to happen, he confessed to the guard on duty that he could control the rain. It was possible. He could do it. The water which he saw, and indeed had been triggered to attend by Decker's cellmate, was conjured by Decker's design. Somewhat understandably, the guard was skeptical of what must have sounded like a young man's delusional ramblings, and so challenged Decker to make it rain in the warden's office. The warden, Dave Keenhold, was unaware of the situation. At the time, he was alone in the administration area, sitting at the desk, writing a report. Oddly, he later claimed that he didn't feel anything, but his shirt was drooping down when an officer entered the room and alerted him to a wet stain on his clothing. It was right about the center of his sternum, about 4 inches long, 2 inches wide. According to the warden, he was somehow saturated with water. I was startled, he claimed. I was scared. The officer was frightened at that particular time, and I just didn't have an explanation for why it happened. And so it seemed that Decker had done as the guard had asked. In response to what was increasingly becoming an out-of-control situation, the warden made a frantic call to Reverend William Blackburn, pleading with him to help. He agreed, and so it was that the warden brought a very meek and mild-mannered Don Decker to him in a room. Decker supposedly told him that he could make it rain and that crosses placed on his body burned. Unimpressed, the Reverend tried to convince the young man to admit that it was all a pretense. It was then that, according to Reverend Blackburn's testimony, Decker's demeanor entirely changed, and a sinister smell came into the room. Nurses and doctors, he later explained, say when you walk into a room where someone is dying with a cancer or something, usually there's a smell. You can tell when you walk into the room. I smelled a smell like that, multiplied 5 times at least. Evil. Foreboding. Then, so the Reverend claimed, Decker raised his hand and rubbed his fingers together. Immediately, it started to rain. It was, so Reverend Blackburn asserted, like the devil's rain. It was a mist, and he was convinced that he was in the presence of evil. Terrified and confused, he then described how he opened up the Bible and started to read to him. Fascinatingly, so he alleged, the pages never got wet. It was a frightening thing. I think I was praying more for me than him. I prayed, and it was only a brief period, and the rain stopped. And not only did the rain supposedly stop, but Decker also seemed to have visibly changed. Similar to the change which is said to have come over him when the evangelical preacher prayed at the keeper's house, Decker is said to have subsided, with both men, it seems, sensing a feeling of peace. With teary eyes, Decker is claimed to have thanked the Reverend for his help, hugging him, after which they prayed together. In this way, the Reverend was convinced that Decker had been possessed, and that what he had done in the room, the stench and the rain which he had caused had been spiritual, but not of God. Recalling the events of that day, Don Decker has since explained that it all ended then and there, and that none of what he experienced those few dramatic days ever happened again. As for the cause of it all, he was convinced it was due to his grandfather. "I think what had happened was his doing," Decker has stated. "Because he abused me when I was young, he got a chance to abuse me again." Attending his funeral had thus been the trigger. Years after the happenings, Chip Decker, a paranormal investigator with no relation to Don, and Peter Jordan analysed the case and were particularly impressed by the eyewitness accounts, most especially the well-seasoned police officers that were obviously rather frightened and shaken by this, but also had the powers of observation. Not merely that, they deemed the Rainboy case to be by far the singularly most fascinating and important case of possible demonic infestation that they had been involved in. After all, a total of 9 eyewitnesses, including 4 police officers, were willing to go on record about the incidents, with them continuing to believe that Decker was possessed by the devil all those years later. And so a sensational case indeed. Yet, considering how recent it is said to have occurred, dating to 1983, and the high number of named witnesses involved, it can be said to be distinctly strange that there is no physical, photographic, or video evidence to sustain the claims made. Furthermore, when the Rainboy became the Rainman years later, the story was retold with new details which, although served to make the case even more sinister, somewhat damaged the credibility surrounding it. The popular TV show Paranormal Witness aired the Rainman episode on the 12th of October 2011, reigniting interest in the case nearly 3 decades after the original events, and some 2 decades after the Unsolved Mysteries episode Rainboy. In the new version of the story, we are told that Don Decker's mother wouldn't allow him to return to his home, and that was the reason why he ended up spending the weekend with the Kiefers, a family who did not know him all too well. A minor detail, and not one that should affect the story told before. However, this, as the episode progresses, reveals itself to be but the first of many such details that are inconsistent and raise suspicions, especially as eyewitness accounts become more sensational and, at times, contradictory. In the original telling of events, we were told that the mysterious happening started in the living room of the house as Decker entered a trance-like state. In the 2011 version, we are now told it all began as he went upstairs to wash his hands for supper and felt the atmosphere change. When he turned to the towel to wipe his hands, all the air went out of the room, like being in a vacuum, with the temperature in the bathroom becoming very low. Decker then claimed that he felt as though he were being attacked by something that was trying to hurt him, and that, when he looked toward the window, he caught a glimpse of that same something. It was a face, he asserted in the episode. It looked like an old man wearing a crown. I looked down, and I saw 3 scratches going down my arm. There was blood at the end, big droplets of blood. Truly striking, and no doubt memorable, and yet there is no mention of this having happened in the original version of the events. And so the story continues. Meanwhile, downstairs, the Kiefers noticed that Decker was taking a little too long, and so they sent one of their children to tell him that dinner was ready. Confused and not wanting to startle his hosts, Decker immediately washed the blood off his arm and joined them at the dinner table. According to Bob Kiefer, Don had a strange look on his face. He seemed pale and visibly pained. And when he reached out for something on the table, Bob immediately noticed the blood marks on his wrist. Seeing them, he allegedly took a hold of the young man's arm and asked what he had done to himself. To this, Decker supposedly replied that he did not do it to himself, and that he swore there was something upstairs, that he had seen a face in the window which looked like the devil. It was after dinner, when the Kiefers were relaxing in the living room, that water began running down one of the walls. Upon touch, the liquid was supposedly sticky and tacky. Noises were heard, suddenly, coming from upstairs, and then the liquid started raining in the room with strange drops moving very fast that got heavier and heavier. When Ron, the landlord, arrived, he and Bob checked the upstairs bathroom and claimed to have felt a creepy feeling there, that it was cold and damp, that it did not feel natural, and that something evil was up there. Downstairs, the rain continued, at which point Decker experienced the trance-like state described before. Bob called Officer John Bojan, who he knew beforehand. When he arrived, he described feeling cold before even witnessing the gravity-defying droplets. And so many additional and undoubtedly terrifying details. It is certainly odd that these, the horrifying reflection in the window, the temperature changes, the blood, the consistency of the liquid, and the feeling of evil, were missing from the original version of events, most especially as they, if true, helped to secure the assessment that what happened to Don Decker was some manner of evil manifestation or demonic possession. They should, in short, have been mentioned. It is, as such, very difficult to tiptoe around the glaringly obvious fact that the story that was told the second time around was purposefully creepier and more sensational than the original telling. For example, according to the 2011 paranormal witness testimonies, after levitating and being shoved into the wall, Decker described being scratched on his arm, not just 3 times, but in the shape of a king's crown. Presumably some relation to the crown-wearing old man demon he had seen staring at him in the window. Furthermore, the way in which all eyewitnesses claim to have immediately suspected Don of being responsible, and responsible in a demonic way, even before the supposed attack on him, is alarming. That no one played the role of the critical thinker or decided to collect evidence is likewise a missed opportunity for validation if the events are to be confirmed as true. Instead, there appears to have been much to condition people, both the viewer and even quite possibly those involved at the time, to expect something evil to be going on. According to Warden Keenholt, different shifts and officers spoke of Decker and that there was a lot of fright in the jail. Everyone, from inmates to guards, knew what happened at the house and were supposedly scared, because there was just something unnatural and evil about Donald. Let us not forget that contrary to these claims of predestined evil, in the original version of the story, the very same young man was regarded as one of the most quiet and introverted inmates at Monroe County Jail. And so, the 2011 retelling of Decker's case brought new claims to light, but no new evidence to sustain them. It also arguably damaged the validity of all that was said before, and so the case has, in the years since, become even more controversial than before. Online commentators who claim to have known Decker at one point or another have alleged that he often claimed to be able to make it rain. Others allege to have been at the restaurant when Decker and the Kiefers were there, and saw the rain for themselves firsthand. Many are as such willing to forgive some of the later embellishments, being overall convinced as to the case's validity. And yet not everyone has been so easily convinced. One of those who has assessed the case most critically is Robert Bartholomew, an American medical sociologist, author, professor, research fellow with the Center for Inquiry in Amherst, and honorary member of the Department of Psychological Medicine at the University of Auckland. While he, like everyone else, agrees that at the time of the events, Decker was under extreme stress, serving jail time and experiencing the death of a relative whom he loathed, and as such may have experienced trance-like states, Bartholomew is more inclined to believe that such so-called trance states may be triggered by stress, and do not necessarily denote mental illness or disorder. Additionally, he has pointed out that such trance-like states are also easily faked. Furthermore, he noted that it is remarkable that Decker did not receive medical attention, and instead attempts were made to exorcise him. If the witnesses were so quick to assume a demonic explanation, their perceptions may have been affected by their willingness to interpret other naturalistic events within a supernatural framework. Summarized, that a worldview which sees demonic influence may end up seeing it in places it does not exist. In this way, for Bartholomew, the testimony of the chief of police at the time, Gary Roberts, is highly interesting. He was, after all, the only witness who did not believe any of the paranormal claims. Speaking with him, Bartholomew was able to confirm that Roberts believed that the water was a natural and not supernatural event. And although he was called to the house on 2 separate occasions, and not just one as we are led to believe, he did not find anything unusual. Sometimes what people believe happens, and what actually happens are 2 different things, Roberts said defiantly. It is also perhaps noteworthy that, in a small town where everyone knew everyone else, the skeptical Chief Roberts was an outsider, having moved there only 3 years prior for the position. And Bartholomew did not stop at criticizing eyewitness accounts in his analysis of the Rainboy case. He also investigated possible natural explanations for the alleged events. Intriguingly, he found that according to a report on moisture problems in manufactured homes published by the Manufactured Housing Research Alliance, Pennsylvania is at moderate to high risk for winter moisture problems, with one of the most severe events being ice damming. This is caused by warm air entering an attic that melts snow on the outer surface of a roof, resulting in an accumulation of ice under which pools of water form and eventually leak. Ice dams are common after major snowstorms in areas where the temperatures rise above freezing during the day and fall below 32 Fahrenheit at night. And rather damningly for the claims of supernatural manifestation, such conditions were applicable in Stroudsburg, Pennsylvania. According to the weather records for the nearby town of Scranton, February the 11th to 28th, 1983, there was record snowfall across central and eastern Pennsylvania. East Stroudsburg University measured 1 inch of snow on the 10th and 16 inches on the 11th. After the storm on the 11th, clear, cold weather settled in. Then, between the 14th and the 25th, the daytime temperatures were above freezing by up to 20 degrees, and with 3 exceptions, they were below freezing at night. Ideal conditions for ice damming, as the snow would have melted by day and refrozen overnight. Then, on the fateful evening of the 26th, there was a mild cold snap with a daytime high of 26 degrees and an overnight low of 20 degrees. Bartholomew's theory that this, the entirely natural phenomenon of ice damming, could have been the cause of the rain is further supported by specialist in environmental design and ice damming Patrick Heumann of the University of Minnesota. According to his expertise, it is actually common for ice damming events to be limited to a small portion of a house, such as a single room, like in Decker's case. And water running down ceilings and walls often mixes with resins in the wood or residue from plaster, giving the water a tacky feel, which would explain the liquid described by Kiefer. Explaining the escalation from wall drips to rain within the room, Heumann says that symptoms beginning at the outer edge and working in towards the ceiling are common. Just as the rain first appeared in the Kiefer home, the occupants reported hearing a loud noise from above. Such sounds are consistent with ice damming. The popping and cracking noises were accompanied by what could have been a section of ice cracking or falling off the roof, releasing the dammed water and causing the so-called indoor rain. And water seeping into the house's insulation could have easily made the indoor temperature several degrees cooler, another of the observations made by those involved. And so, according to Bartholomew, the most plausible explanation is that Decker feigned a trance, while those around him, all of whom held deep religious beliefs, interpreted natural events within a Christian frame of reference. Indeed, if faced with similar happenings, it can be said that most people, especially law enforcement, would collect evidence or request medical assistance for someone in a seeming trance. The eyewitnesses in Decker's case, however, immediately suspected him of demonic activity. When most police go to a house and cannot explain something, Bartholomew states, they do not assume that one of the occupants is possessed by the devil. As for the rain, he believes it to be snowmelt seeping through the ceiling from the attic as a result of ice damming, in conjunction with psychological stress and human imagination. He likewise does not exclude deception or Decker's augmentation of an already existing phenomenon by playing tricks. and not one to withdraw the knife after inflicting a wound, Bartholomew also does not shy away from poking holes in Decker's character. 3 years after the initial episode, Decker was back in jail after pleading guilty to burglary. Then, in October 2012, Decker was arrested again and charged with arson and mail fraud. Bartholomew encourages us to ask whether or not someone who is known for repeatedly breaking the law can be trusted to be ethical and truthful about a paranormal experience. And so, for Bartholomew, the truth is straightforward. A classic case of social delusion fueled by a natural phenomenon. For Decker, on the other hand, what happened to him was caused by his grandfather, an evil man who wanted to hurt him again. For the eyewitnesses around him, the rain and the strange look on the young man's face were the work of the devil. And for us, only a few things are certain. Not insignificantly that, with the passage of time, the accounts of Rainboy have become more and more sensational. It is said that the devil is in the details, and yet in the case of the alleged demonic possession of Donald Decker, it seems as though on this occasion he may have been thoroughly absent. Thank you so much for watching. As ever, I truly hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please don't forget to like and subscribe for more of the paranormal. Equally, you can visit paranormalscholar.com to sign up to my email newsletter and receive notifications of all new videos straight to your email inbox. And finally, if you cannot wait until my next video, why not watch the one suggested on the screen now? Until next time,